Jen and Amanda Eckert was indicted earlier this month. He pled not guilty in a virtual hearing yesterday, and in today's bond hearing, the judge released him on certain conditions. In the indictment, it states from September 2019 to May 2020, 56-year-old Robert Eckert distributed child pornography. Federal investigators recovered images of a minor engaging in a sexually explicit behavior. It is alleged Eckert used several online platforms to distribute these images and discussed with others about the distribution of child pornography. Investigators added Eckert used his phone at his home and at the Lutz Children's Museum to access these images. The indictment goes on to state Eckert's cell phone was seized from him June of last year. An attorney releasing the statement on behalf of the museum saying in part, quote, "The museum has cooperated with the federal investigation into Mr. Eckert and will continue to assist investigators as necessary and appropriate. To date, there is no evidence or allegations that any museum patrons or staff were impacted by Mr. Eckert's alleged actions." If Eckert is convicted, he faces a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison and a maximum of 20 years. During the bond hearing, the judge stated Eckert will have no access to internet at home. He must restrict himself to his home and is not allowed to travel out of Connecticut. His wife, Cheryl Eckert, also agreed to monitor Eckert's behavior at home. And Eckert has been permanently terminated from the museum. He was released on a $100,000 bond. Live in Manchester, Carmen Chow, Fox 61 News.